It began with a scream in the night. In the cold winter of 1692, the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, was plunged into a nightmare. On a frigid January evening, Reverend Samuel Parris was awakened by his 9-year-old daughter Betty, who convulsed violently in her bed, eyes rolling back into her head as she let out blood-curdling cries. Her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, suffered the same terrifying fits, her limbs thrashing in unnatural contortions. Both girls claimed invisible hands were squeezing their throats, and unseen forces tormented them relentlessly. The Puritan villagers of Salem were deeply religious and feared the devil lurked around every corner. In their minds, the devil had found a way into their tight-knit community, and worse, he had corrupted their children. As days passed, more young girls in Salem began showing the same alarming symptoms. Violent fits, uncontrollable screaming, and hallucinations of dark, spectral figures. Medical professionals of the time, believing there was no natural explanation, deemed it the work of witchcraft. And soon, fingers pointed to the unlikeliest of culprits. Local women accused of making pacts with Satan himself. In the feverish paranoia that gripped the village, the first 3 women to face accusations were all outsiders to the Puritan community. Tituba, a slave from Barbados who worked in Reverend Parris's household, was said to have told stories of witchcraft and black magic to the young girls. Sarah Good, a destitute beggar with a troubled reputation, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly and sickly woman who had not attended church in years, were also easy targets. Under the weight of fear and the threat of death, Tituba confessed. She claimed that not only had she practiced witchcraft, but that Good and Osborne were also in league with the devil. More terrifying still, Tituba claimed there were other witches hiding in plain sight within Salem. An unknown number of villagers had turned to dark forces. The confession sent a shockwave through the town. If Tituba could bewitch the children, who else might be working in secret to destroy the community from within? Once the first accusations were made, hysteria spread like wildfire. Neighbors turned on one another, driven by suspicion, jealousy, and old grudges. The list of accused swelled with alarming speed, sweeping up both the innocent and the vulnerable. Women who once seemed ordinary were now whispered about in the streets. Hadn't she been acting strange lately? Wasn't her milk curdled last week? Why did her child fall ill after speaking to her? What began as a small group of young girls accusing a handful of women escalated into a full-blown frenzy. Entire families were implicated. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her piety, was accused despite her long-standing reputation as a good Christian. As accusations flew wildly, no one was safe. The gallows awaited anyone who dared question the growing insanity. By the summer of 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had fully taken hold. The courtroom was a scene of horror and chaos. The afflicted girls would scream, writhe, and collapse as they pointed out witches in the courtroom, claiming invisible spirits were attacking them. Judges, priests, and jurors watched in awe and fear, believing these outbursts to be genuine signs of demonic possession. Evidence presented in court was flimsy at best, relying heavily on spectral evidence. Claims that the spirits of the accused were tormenting their victims, often while the accused were miles away. In one notorious case, a man claimed to have seen the apparition of George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem, strangle a woman in a vision. Burroughs, despite his protests of innocence and his years of service to the town, was hanged, even after reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly. A feat many believed impossible for a witch. The most shocking moment came in late July when Rebecca Nurse, the gentle grandmother, was sentenced to hang. Her execution caused a ripple of doubt among some villagers. If even Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, what hope was there for the rest of them? The scaffolding stood as a symbol of the growing madness. Each hanging seemed to feed the paranoia rather than quench it. By autumn, the community's soul had been irreparably scarred. The gallows creaked under the weight of the executed. 19 people were hanged, and one man, Giles Corey, was crushed to death. Corey, a stubborn and elderly farmer, refused to plead guilty or innocent to the charges of witchcraft. As punishment, he was subjected to pressing, a brutal method of torture where heavy stones were placed on his chest in an attempt to force a confession. As more rocks were piled on, witnesses heard him groan in defiance. More weight. Corey's death was a turning point. His refusal to submit and the horror of his death finally caused some to question whether the trials had gone too far. What began as an effort to root out evil now seemed like a witch hunt in the truest sense. An act of collective madness driven by fear and superstition. By early 1693, the hysteria had run its course, but not before claiming the lives of 25 innocent people, including those who died in prison awaiting trial. Governor William Phips, finally alarmed by the growing number of innocent deaths, stepped in to halt the trials. The use of spectral evidence was banned, and many of the convicted were pardoned. The courts were dissolved, but the damage had already been done. The survivors of the trials lived with the scars of the event for the rest of their lives. Some of the accusers later recanted their claims, admitting that their fits had been exaggerated or even faked. But for many in Salem, the memory of the witch trials lingered like a ghost in the town's collective conscience. Even today, over 300 years later, the story of Salem remains a chilling reminder of how fear and hysteria can tear a community apart. In the months and years following the Salem Witch Trials, the town slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the collective guilt weighed heavily on the community. Many of those who had fervently participated in the trials began to question their own roles in the tragedy. How could a God-fearing village, built on the principles of Christian piety and justice, have spiraled so wildly out of control? Reverend Samuel Parris, whose own household had sparked the initial hysteria, faced mounting pressure from the villagers who began to turn against him. His involvement in fueling the accusations and his unyielding stance against those accused of witchcraft earned him widespread resentment. The fact that it was his daughter and niece who had ignited the flames of accusation was a stain he could not erase. By 1696, Parris was forced to resign from his position as minister and leave Salem, disgraced and ostracized. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching, known as the Day of Repentance, to acknowledge the great injustices committed during the trials. Many of those who had participated in the trials, including judges and jurors, made public confessions of guilt. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the key figures in condemning the accused, stood before his congregation and asked for forgiveness, acknowledging the wrongful deaths of those executed. But perhaps the most harrowing moment came from Ann Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers during the trials. In 1706, 14 years after the final witch had been hanged, Anne stood before her church and confessed that her accusations had been false and that she had been deluded by Satan. Her public apology offered a haunting glimpse into the minds of those who had driven the hysteria. Young girls swept up in a storm of fear, superstition and attention, who had no idea the horrors they were unleashing on their neighbors. Yet, despite these gestures of contrition, the scars of Salem were not so easily healed. The families of the victims were left to grapple with the loss of their loved ones, and the town's reputation as a place where justice had faltered forever lingered. The name Salem became synonymous with paranoia, fanaticism, and cruelty. For the descendants of those wrongly accused and executed, the stain of the trials remained, a dark shadow cast over their family names for generations. What drove Salem into such madness? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some point to the repressive nature of Puritan society, where fear of the unknown and a strict religious code created fertile ground for hysteria. Others suggest that local rivalries and personal grudges were at play, with villagers using the accusations to settle old scores and seize land. The young girls at the center of the accusations may have been caught in a web of their own creation. Once their outbursts began, there was no turning back. Confessing that they had fabricated the entire ordeal would have meant certain punishment. In the years following the trials, many of those involved sought to distance themselves from the tragedy. The courts that had overseen the executions were dissolved, and new laws were put in place to prevent such injustices from ever happening again. By the early 1700s, Salem had tried to forget its painful past, but the memory of the witch hunts continued to haunt New England. The story of Salem is not merely a tale of hysteria and violence. It is a cautionary story about what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when superstition eclipses justice, and when the thirst for control destroys the lives of the innocent. The eerie silence of Salem today, its empty streets, historic houses, and preserved gallows, seems to whisper the ghosts of its past, reminding us that the darkness of those times still lingers, waiting to be remembered. Today, visitors to Salem are drawn to the remnants of this chilling history. The Salem Witch Museum stands as a stark reminder of the trials, and guided tours of the town take visitors past the haunted places where accusations were hurled and lives were destroyed. The old burial grounds hold the remains of some of the key figures of the trials, their headstones worn and crumbling, as if nature itself seeks to erase the memory of the terror they unleashed. Many claim that the town of Salem is haunted not just by the spectre of its dark past, but by actual spirits, the restless souls of those who were wrongfully executed, still seeking justice. In the silence of the night, some say you can hear faint whispers on the wind, or see shadowy figures passing through the narrow, crooked streets. These tales only add to the town's mystique, attracting tourists and paranormal enthusiasts from around the world. But beneath the ghost stories and the tourist attractions, the deeper lesson of Salem remains. The witch trials were a moment when fear triumphed over logic, when the desire for control led to chaos, and when innocence was sacrificed to maintain a fragile sense of order. The story of the Salem Witch Trials is a story of humanity's darkest instincts, our ability to destroy each other when we believe we are fighting evil. For Salem, the trials will never truly be over. Though centuries have passed, the haunting spectre of those dark days continues to loom large, A chilling reminder of what lies at the heart of human nature when we let fear take control.